Welcome to Van Cortlandt House. My name is Laura Carpenter-Myers and I'm the director of the museum. For today's video, I'm going to present to you a brief Van Cortlandt House and Museum 101. Thanks for joining me. Van Cortlandt 101 begins with a quick look at the men whose lives helped establish Van Cortlandt House Museum as we have it today as a National Historic Landmark, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and designated a New York City landmark for both its exterior and interiors. We start at the beginning with Oloff Stevense Van Cortlandt, who came to New Amsterdam in 1638. Although there is a portrait of Oloff Van Cortlandt that's available through a Google search on the internet, we know very little about him as a person from this portrait, other than the fact that he was wealthy enough to have commissioned a portrait. We don't know who owns the portrait. We don't know how old he was when it was painted, but we will continue to conduct research so we can learn more about Oloff. It was Oloff's son, Augustus Van Cortlandt, who started purchasing land in what is now Van Cortlandt Park, but was then Little Yonkers or Lower Yonkers in Westchester County. His first purchase took place around 1691 in this area, and it was Augustus Van Cortlandt who more or less established the family as a milling family or having milling operations. Augustus and his neighbor were the ones who directed the damming of Tibbetts Brook to form the lake in Van Cortlandt Park. We can see this influence in the family's adopted coat of arms, which includes the sails of a windmill to represent their milling operations, and grain milling in particular. New York as a colony was so prolific in creating grain and flour that it was known as the breadbasket of the colonies, and the Van Cortlandt family played a not so small role in creating this designation for New York as a colony. It was Jacobus's son Frederick who inherited the plantation around 1739 upon his father's death. Frederick Van Cortlandt began building Van Cortlandt House in 1748, approximately 10 years later. It's entirely likely that Frederick and his family lived elsewhere on the plantation as the house was being built, because in his will, Frederick Van Cortlandt mentions that he is about building, meaning in the process of building, a stone house on the plantation upon which he now lives. So that's a big clue that although the house didn't exist prior to 1748, Frederick and his family were likely living here at Van Cortlandt House. We can see sort of what Frederick's vision for his house was through the landscape portrait of the house painted by George Harvey, seen here. It was James Van Cortlandt who next inherited the house in 1749 after his father passed away in late 1748, before the house was even completed. James Van Cortlandt owned the house during the Revolutionary War and the colonial period leading up to the Revolutionary War. James was a member of the Committee of Safety. He was the Westchester County Supervisor of Highways, which meant that if a road had potholes, he was responsible for making sure that it got fixed. And he was also responsible for making sure that roads throughout Lower Westchester County were constructed. After James's decease in 1781, the house was inherited by his youngest brother, Augustus Van Cortlandt, who held the property and lived in the house from 1781 to 1823. After Augustus's passing, we end our interpretive period, but to get a sense of Augustus Van Cortlandt, we'll look at the portrait of Augustus by John Wesley Jarvis that was painted in about 1810, about 13 years or so before he passed away. The portrait shows Augustus as very much a patrician older man with gray hair and a very somber suit, but represents a pretty good image of what he really did look like. It's not the most flattering portrait. So these lives were important to the foundation of Van Cortlandt family in America. They're important to Van Cortlandt House Museum, but as I mentioned previously, they're not the whole story of Van Cortlandt. And so moving forward from Van Cortlandt 101, the future videos will include a broader, more inclusive history for Van Cortlandt House that we hope to bring to light, to present new scholarship, and really get an ability for people who can't necessarily visit Van Cortlandt House in person, a chance to sort of know the behind the scenes, the lesser known history of Van Cortlandt House. Thank you for joining me.